Her inheritance was a parcel of land and a forgotten name. To her uncle it was a prize to be stolen. He dragged her to the convent gates, trading her future for a title deed, masking his greed with a pious smile. He called her a holy offering, but she was a prisoner, condemned to a life of silence behind walls of cold stone. As the iron gate began to close on her world forever, she sent one last, hopeless prayer into the wind. She didn't know that prayer would be answered. From the road, a lone knight, burdened by a broken vow, saw not a willing bride of the church. He saw an injustice that had to be undone. For more stories where steel and sorrow find their solace, join our fellowship by subscribing and let us know where our saga has reached you. The autumn wind was a blade against Avelina's cheek. It carried the scent of damp earth and dying leaves, a final funereal perfume for the life she was about to leave behind. The stones of the convent wall were grey and unforgiving, sweating a cold mist that soaked into the thin wool of her cloak. Before her the iron and oak gate stood like the entrance to a tomb. Her uncle, Lord Valerius, held her arm. His grip was not that of a caring guardian, but of a merchant securing his goods. To the world he presented the face of sorrowful piety, a man nobly surrendering his last living kin to the service of God. But Avelina felt the truth in the tight pinch of his fingers, in the cold satisfaction that glinted deep within his eyes. She was not a soul to be saved. She was an inheritance to be claimed. "The abbess is a woman of great repute," Valerius said, his voice smooth and loud enough for the two stern nuns at the gate to hear. "You will find peace in these hallowed walls, niece, a serenity the world cannot provide." He spoke of peace, but his actions had brought her nothing but terror. He spoke of serenity, but her heart was a storm of grief and betrayal. She looked from his false face to the weathered stone and saw no difference. Both were prisons. The abbess appeared, a figure carved from ice and judgment. Her wimple was stark white, her face a web of fine lines that showed no softness. She looked at Avelina not as a frightened girl, but as a contract to be fulfilled. Her gaze assessed the quality of Avelina's worn dress, the slender frame, the downcast eyes. She was an asset, a novice, whose small but useful lands would now belong to the order. Lord Valerius, the abbess, acknowledged with a curt nod. "The child is prepared. She is eager to begin her service," Valerius lied, giving Avelina's arm a sharp squeeze. Avelina flinched but remained silent. Her voice had been stolen from her weeks ago, lost in a storm of pleas that had broken against her uncle's unmovable greed. Silence was all she had left. The transaction was complete. A bag of silver exchanged hands, a donation to seal the arrangement and soothe any lingering questions of propriety. Avelina felt herself being pushed forward, from her uncle's cold grasp to the nun's indifferent hands. This was the moment of her erasure. She would become Sister Agnes or Sister Clare, and the girl who was Avelina, who loved the scent of rain on summer dust and the warmth of a sleeping hound at her feet, would cease to exist. She cast one last look over her shoulder, at the muddy road and the skeletal trees reaching for a grey sky. It was a bleak and desolate world, but it was a world of freedom, a world she was losing forever. Her lips moved, forming a silent, desperate prayer, not to the cold god of the convent, but to the memory of her mother and father, a plea for a deliverance she knew would never come. The great gate began to groan shut, the sound of her future being sealed. But from that muddy road the scene was viewed with different eyes. A lone rider sat upon a warhorse, a silhouette of steel and shadow against the dying light. He had been traveling for weeks, the weariness of the road settling deep into his bones, a weariness matched only by the ache of a promise he had failed to keep for 10 long years. Sir Cailan of Blackwood Reach had not intended to stop. His journey was one of grim purpose, a return to the lonely keep that served as his own self-imposed exile. But he had seen the girl. He had seen the uncle whose smile did not reach his eyes. He had seen the abbess, whose piety was as cold as a winter tomb. He was a man who understood injustice. He had seen it in the sun-baked lands of the East, in the courts of greedy lords, in the desperation of the common folk. And he saw it now, in the terror that radiated from the small figure being swallowed by the convent's shadow. A knight's duty was to protect the weak, a vow he had repeated 1,000 times, a vow that had grown hollow with his own personal failure. But as he watched the girl's shoulders slump in final defeat, something shifted within him, a dormant instinct, a flicker of the man he was before. Grief had weathered him, stirred to life. He saw not a willing novice, but a sacrifice. He saw not a holy transaction, but a sale. The heavy gate clanged, the sound of the lock sliding into place echoing across the quiet landscape. For the girl, it was the end. For the knight, it was a call to arms. He gathered the reins, his jaw set like granite. His horse, sensing the sudden tension in its master, shifted eagerly. The long, dormant embers of duty had been fanned into a quiet, burning flame. He urged the great horse forward, its hooves striking the road with a new and resolute purpose. The world inside the convent walls was one of echoing stone and chilling silence. Avelina was led down a long, vaulted corridor where the only light came from high, narrow windows that showed nothing but slivers of an indifferent sky. The air smelled of beeswax, cold stone, and something else, something like dried herbs and decay. It was the smell of a life lived indoors, away from sun and wind and rain. Her despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the breath from her lungs. This was it. The last of her fight had drained away the moment the gate had locked. Now there was only this slow, shuffling walk toward an existence that was not her own. The nun guiding her did not speak, her beads clicking softly with each step, a quiet countdown to the end of Avelina's world. Lord Valerius and the abbess were concluding their business in a small office near the gate. His face was flushed with success, his mind already calculating the profits from Avelina's lands. The abbess was counting the silver, her expression one of grim satisfaction. The matter was settled. Then came the sound, a loud, percussive boom that shattered the convent's sacred quiet. It was not the knock of a weary traveler or a humble pilgrim. It was the sound of a gauntleted fist striking oak, a sound of pure, unyielding authority. The abbess looked up, her lips tightening in annoyance. Valerius scowled, irritated by the interruption to his victory. Another boom, louder this time, reverberated through the stone, making a hanging iron cross tremble on the wall. A frightened novice was sent to the gate's peephole. She scurried back, her face pale. "It is a knight, Reverend Mother," she whispered. "Alone, but he is armed for war." Before the abbess could give an order, the knight's voice cut through the thick wood of the gate, as clear and cold as a winter river. "Open this gate in the name of the king's law." The command was so absolute, so laced with power, that the nuns obeyed without question. The locks were drawn, the heavy bolts pulled back, and the gate swung inward to reveal the rider. Sir Cailan dismounted in one fluid motion, his armored feet landing on the ground with a heavy thud. He stood framed in the gateway, a figure of iron and grim resolve, his presence seeming to suck all the light and air from the courtyard. Valerius strode forward, his face a mask of indignation. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a holy sanctuary. You have no right." Cailan's gaze swept past him, as if he were nothing more than a buzzing fly, his eyes scanning the courtyard until they found Avelina, standing frozen in the corridor's entrance. He looked back at the abbess, who had now joined them. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am Sir Cailan of Blackwood Reach," he stated, the words flat and hard. "The girl, Avelina of Stonefield, is the sole surviving child of a vassal family sworn to my house. The law is clear. I claim the right of wardship." The words hung in the air, more shocking than any drawn sword. Avelina stared, her mind struggling to comprehend. Wardship? Her father had been a minor lord, but she had never heard of an allegiance to the remote and feared Blackwood Reach. Valerius laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Absurd. She has no guardian but me. Her lands are adjacent to mine. I am her blood. You are a stranger. She has been committed to the church." "She was committed by you," Cailan countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "A guardian cannot dispose of a ward's future for personal gain. That is not law, that is theft." He took a deliberate step forward, and Valerius, for all his bluster, instinctively took a step back. The abbess held up a hand. "Sir Knight, this is a matter for the scribes and the bishop. The arrangement has been sealed." For the first time, Cailan's expression changed. A flicker of profound impatience crossed his features. He reached for the leather pouch at his belt, not for a weapon, but for a purse heavy with coin. He tossed it onto the stone ground at the abbess's feet. It landed with a solid final thud, the sound of a debt being paid in full. "Your contract is with Lord Valerius," Calen said. "My right is with the girl's bloodline. Consider your trouble paid for." His gaze left the stunned abbess and the sputtering lord. It settled on Avelina, pinning her in place. It was not a kind look, nor a cruel one. It was the look of a man who had made a decision and would not be turned from it. "Girl," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Come." Avelina stood paralyzed. To stay meant a living death, a slow fading into nothingness. To go with this terrifying stranger was to leap from a cliff into an unknown darkness. She looked at her uncle's face, now twisted with pure, murderous rage. Then she looked at the knight, whose grim expression promised nothing but an escape from this single unbearable moment. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. She walked past the abbess, past her uncle, who reached for her, but was stopped by a single warning glare from Calen. She did not stop until she stood before the knight, a small trembling bird in the shadow of an eagle. He gave a curt nod, then turned and walked back toward the gate without a word, trusting she would follow. She did. He swung himself onto his horse, then looked down at her. He reached down a gauntleted hand. Avelina hesitated for only a second before placing her small hand in his. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, setting her in front of him on the great war-horse. With a final look of cold dismissal at the apoplectic Lord Valerius, Calen turned the horse and spurred it out of the convent gates, leaving behind a shattered contract and a vow of vengeance hanging in the cold autumn air. Avelina clung to the saddle, the world she knew, gone, propelled into a new and terrifying future by a silent knight whose reasons were a complete and utter mystery. The ride was a blur of wind and rhythmic hoofbeats. Avelina was pressed against the hard planes of the knight's armor, the cold of his steel seeping through her cloak. He said nothing. The silence stretched for hours, broken only by the creak of leather and the horse's steady breathing. She dared not ask where they were going. The sheer, intimidating power of the man before her was a wall she could not breach. His back was rigid, his focus fixed on the path ahead, a path that led them away from the rolling fields she knew and into a wilder, more rugged land of stone and gorse. They rode until the sun was a faint, bruised smear on the horizon, and the world had turned to shades of grey and black. Avelina's body ached with a weariness so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. Just as she thought she could hold on no longer, the knight guided his horse up a steep, winding track, and then she saw it. Blackwood Reach was not a castle from a storybook. It was a fortress, a jagged tooth of dark stone rising from a windswept hill, outlined against the last of the dying light. It was built not for beauty or comfort, but for war. Its walls were high and thick, its windows mere slits, its single tower a grim sentinel watching over the desolate borderlands. It looked as unyielding and forbidding as the man who was taking her there. Fear, which had been a constant companion all day, coiled tighter in her stomach. The thunder of their horses' hooves on a wooden drawbridge announced their arrival. The portcullis, a great iron grid, was already raised. Men-at-arms clad in leather and carrying spears stood guard. They watched their lord approach with a disciplined stillness, their gazes flicking to Avelina with a guarded curiosity before returning to their posts. They were hard men, their faces etched with the lines of past battles, but there was none of the leering contempt she had seen in her uncle's soldiers. There was only a quiet, professional watchfulness. Calen swung down from his horse, and then, with the same impersonal strength as before, lifted her to the ground. Her legs, numb from the long ride, nearly buckled beneath her. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch brief and firm, before releasing her and striding into the great hall. The hall was vast, its ceiling lost in a gloom of smoke-blackened rafters. A massive fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast an ox, casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and damp stone. A few long tables and benches were the only furnishings. Weapons hung on the walls, swords, axes, and grim-looking pikes, their steel catching the firelight. It was a man's world, a soldier's world. There was no sign of a woman's touch, no tapestry, no scattered cushions, nothing to soften the hall's stark, masculine severity. An older woman, with a face as stern as the abbess's but with eyes that held a weary sort of intelligence, approached from the shadows. She wore a simple grey dress, and her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She dipped her head slightly to Caelan. "My lord, you have returned." Her gaze fell on Avelina, her expression unreadable. "This is Avelina, my ward," Caelan stated, the word ward sounding strange and formal in the grim hall. "See that she has a room, a bath, and food. She is not to be disturbed." It was the most he had said all day. The woman, who Avelina learned was named Elspeth, nodded once. "As you command." Caelan gave Avelina one last, fleeting look, then turned and walked toward a stone staircase at the far end of the hall, disappearing into the shadows without a backward glance. He had saved her, and then he had abandoned her. Elspeth's presence was brusque, but not unkind. "Come, child. You look half dead on your feet." She led Avelina up a winding stair to a small private chamber. It was as sparse as the rest of the keep, containing only a narrow bed covered in thick furs, a wooden chest, and a small arched window. But the room was clean, and a small fire had been lit in the hearth, chasing away the bone-deep chill. A wooden tub was already being filled by two servants with buckets of steaming water. After a bath that washed away the grime of the road and some of the terror, Avelina found a simple woolen nightdress laid out for her and a tray. Of food on the chest, a bowl of thick hot stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a cup of watered wine. She ate, the warmth spreading through her, a small comfort in a world of overwhelming uncertainty. When she was finished, she explored her small sanctuary. The window was too narrow to climb through, but it offered a dizzying view of the dark, windswept hills under a blanket of stars. The door was solid oak, and on it, set into the thick wood, was a heavy iron bolt and a thick wooden bar that could be dropped into a sturdy brace on the frame. The lock was on her side. She ran her hand over the rough, cool wood of the bar. For months, she had lived at the mercy of others. Her uncle had controlled her fate, the abbess her future. But here, in this strange, cold fortress, owned by a silent, forbidding knight, she had been given a room with a lock she controlled. Avelina slid the bolt home and dropped the heavy bar into place. The solid, definitive, was the most comforting sound she had ever heard. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, and for the first time since her parents had died, she felt a profound, shuddering wave of relief wash over her. She was a captive, a ward, a mystery to herself. But tonight, in this room, she was safe, and in the sudden, echoing silence of the keep, she finally, truly took her first breath. Days in Blackwood Reach were measured by the ringing of the training yard bell and the changing of the guard. Avelina learned the keeps, rhythms from the safety of the shadows, a ghost in the halls of a man who was himself a ghost of sorts. She watched Sir Caelan from a distance. He was a creature of disciplined routine, rising before dawn to train with his men, his movements with a longsword a blur of deadly grace. He managed his domain with a terse efficiency, his voice a low rumble that commanded immediate obedience. He never spoke to her, and after that first night, he barely seemed to see her. Yet she knew he did. She felt his eyes on her sometimes as she sat by the hearth in the great hall, a silent, powerful presence at the far end of his long table. She was his ward, his responsibility, but she felt more like a stray he had brought in from the cold, unsure of what to do with her now that she was there. The loneliness of the keep was a heavy cloak, but it was far preferable to the suffocating fear of her uncle's house. Here, at least, the silence was honest, driven by a need to do something other than sit and wait. She began to explore. In a forgotten corner of the inner bailey, she found a small stone chapel. It was derelict. Dust lay thick as snow on the pews and the altar, and the air was stale with neglect. The place felt as abandoned as her own hopes had been. With a bucket of water and a fistful of rags borrowed from Elspeth, she went to work. She scrubbed the stone floor, wiped down the wood, and pulled back the heavy cobwebs, letting a sliver of sunlight from a high window pierce the gloom. It was a small, quiet rebellion against the darkness. The next morning, when she came down to the great hall, a cloak was draped over her customary seat. It was made of heavy, dark wool and lined with the softest fox fur. It was not new, but it was warm and well tended. No one said a word, but as she drew it around her shoulders, its warmth a comfort against the keep's ever-present chill, she knew it was from him. Her newfound confidence took her to the stables. Caelan's great black war-horse, a magnificent beast named Corvus, was favouring a front leg. The stablemaster, a grizzled veteran named Ivor, complained that the leg was sound, but the horse was agitated. Avelina, remembering the herbal remedies her mother had used, found a patch of wild comfrey and yarrow growing near the base of the wall. She crushed the leaves to make a poultice, and with a hesitant request, earned a skeptical grunt of permission from Ivor to apply it. She spoke softly to the warhorse, her gentle hands, calming the animal as she wrapped the poultice in place. From the walkway above, Caelan watched, his face a mask of stone. That evening, the usual rough pottage was set before her, but beside it was a second, smaller bowl. It was a stew made with rabbit and seasoned with thyme and wild garlic, the exact scent of the stews her mother used to make in the kitchens of Stonefield. She looked up in shock, her eyes searching for him. He was at his table, speaking with his captain, but she felt his awareness of her as surely as she felt the heat from the hearth. Their silent conversation continued. She found his training tunic, carelessly thrown over a chest, a long tear in the sleeve. By the light of her small fire, she mended it with neat, almost invisible stitches, using thread she had painstakingly unravelled from the hem of her own worn dress. She left it folded on the chest, and the next day she saw him wearing it. The most profound exchange came a week later. As she crossed the training yard, a young guardsman, eager to show off for his comrades, called out a coarse jest about their lord's new pet. Avelina froze, her cheeks burning with a familiar shame. Before she could even think to flee, Caelan's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as ice. He did not shout, he simply said the man's name. Bren. The yard fell silent. The young guard went pale, his bravado vanishing like smoke. "My lord," he stammered. Caelan did not look at him. He continued to sharpen his sword, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel the only sound. Yet his displeasure was a palpable force. The guard turned to Avelina, bowed his head low, and mumbled a terrified apology before scurrying away. Caelan had defended her honor without a single glance in her direction. A few days passed in quiet routine. Then one morning Avelina came to her place at the table and found a small object sitting next to her wooden bowl. It was a bird, carved from a piece of dark wood, its surface polished, smooth. The carving was simple but incredibly detailed. It was a falcon, wings swept for a dive, its tiny wooden eyes seeming to hold a fierce and protective loyalty. It was so unexpected, so personal, it took her breath away. This was not a provision for her comfort or a defense of her honor. This was a gift. She picked it up, the wood still holding a faint warmth. Across the cavernous hall, Caelan sat watching her, his usual mask of indifference gone. For a fleeting second, his eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not the grim Lord of Blackwood Reach, but a profound and aching loneliness. She clutched the small falcon in her hand, its solid shape a silent question, an unspoken answer passing between them in the flickering firelight. The small wooden falcon was never far from Avelina's hand. She would hold it in the pocket of her dress, its smooth carved shape a secret source of strength. A quiet understanding had settled between her and the lord of the keep. There were no more words than before, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, but filled with a fragile, unspoken awareness. Caelan watched her bring a gentle order to the forgotten corners of his fortress. The chapel now held wildflowers in a pottery jug. The grim-faced men-at-arms would nod to her as she passed. She was a flicker of warmth in a world of cold stone, and this change unsettled him as much as it soothed him. He found himself observing the small things about her, the way she would hum a half-remembered tune while mending a cloak, a melody that felt strangely familiar, the determined set of her jaw when she argued with Ivor about the best way to treat a horse's sprain. In her, he saw a resilience that reminded him of the granite hills surrounding his keep. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful. It was a feeling he had known only once before, a duty sworn in blood and dust under a scorching foreign sun. One evening, as he stood on the battlements watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of blood and gold, he saw her in the courtyard below. She was tending to a small herb garden she had coaxed back to life in a sheltered patch of earth. The fading light caught in her hair, turning it the color of spun copper. It was the same color as her father's. And just like that, the memory, always lurking beneath the surface, rose up and claimed him. The world of Blackwood Reach dissolved, replaced by the blinding glare and choking. Dust of the Holy Land. He was at the siege of Acre, the air thick with the screams of men and the clang of steel. Beside him, fighting with the desperate courage of a man who wanted to live, was Sir Robert of Stonefield. Robert was his brother in all but blood, a man with a laugh as bright as the sun and eyes the colour of a summer sky. The memory sharpened, focusing on the terrible clarity of a single moment. A Saracen arrow, black and swift, flying true. Robert's gasp, a sound of surprise more than pain. Caelan had cut down the archer a second too late. He knelt in the blood-soaked dirt, pulling his friend into his arms behind the scant cover of a broken wall. The wound was mortal. They both knew it. Robert's bravado crumbled, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. "Caelan," he gasped, his hand fumbling inside his tunic. "My Avelina, my little girl." He had left for the crusade when his daughter was but an infant, a tiny thing with a tuft of copper hair he had sworn to return to. "She will know you were a hero," Caelan had promised, his own voice thick with grief. "A dead hero is just a story," Robert whispered, pressing a small, heavy object into Caelan's hand. "This. It was her mother's. I had it split in two. She wears the other half. It is the only proof." Caelan opened his palm. Lying there was half of a silver amulet, beautifully crafted into the wing and body of a falcon. "Find her," Robert begged, his eyes locking on Caelan's, his grip surprisingly strong. "Protect. Harrison, be the father I cannot. Swear it. Swear it on your honor, on your soul." And Caelan had sworn. It was the last word his friend ever heard. He had returned home not with glory, but with a ghost. He had searched for years, but the trail was cold. Robert's wife had died of a fever soon after he left, and the child, he was told, had been given to distant relatives who had moved north. He followed every lead until they turned to dust. His vow became his failure, his honor a hollow wound. He retreated to Blackwood Reach, the most remote of his holdings, to live with the ghost of his broken promise. The sun had vanished now, leaving the keep in the cold embrace of twilight. Caelan stood alone on the wall, the present once again solid around him. He returned to his chambers, the memory clinging to him like a shroud. From a locked iron box, he took a small leather pouch. Inside was the silver falcon, its edges worn smooth by a decade of guilty remembrance. He walked to his window, which overlooked the small revived herb garden. A single candle burned in Avelina's window across the bailey. He held the silver wing in his hand, the symbol of his greatest failure. He was bound by a sacred oath to protect Robert's daughter, a girl he had never been able to find, and yet he felt that same sacred duty for the girl who now slept under his roof. The orphan he had saved out of a night's simple duty, the quiet girl who was slowly mending the frayed edges of his world with her. Silent acts of care. The irony was a cruel blade in his heart. He was haunted by the daughter he had lost, and now he was being saved by a stranger. He clutched the cold silver in his fist, his knuckles white. He did not know that the lock to his salvation was sleeping just across the courtyard. He knew only the weight of a broken vow, and the strange, fierce, and utterly terrifying hope that the girl in his castle was beginning to inspire. The fragile peace of Blackwood Reach had lasted for nearly a month. It was a time of quiet healing, of unspoken gestures building a delicate bridge between two lonely souls. Avelina had begun to feel the tight knot of fear in her chest finally loosen. She had even been heard laughing, a soft, surprising sound, while helping Elspeth churn butter in the kitchens. The keep, once a symbol of her capture, had begun to feel like the first true home she had ever known. The sanctuary was shattered by the single, sharp blast of a horn from the watchtower. It was a sound rarely heard, a signal that a formal party was approaching under a banner of truce. Caelan was in the training yard, and he looked up, his hand stilling on the hilt of his sword. Avelina, who had been gathering herbs, felt a cold dread wash over her. Visitors were not a feature of life at Blackwood Reach. Visitors meant the outside world, and the outside world was where her monsters lived. From the battlements, they saw the approaching retinue. It was a small but imposing force of 20 armed men. 2 banners flew at its head. One bore the snarling boar of her uncle, Lord Valerius. The other, a golden cross on a field of purple, was the personal standard of the regional bishop. This was not an attack. It was something far worse. It was an execution of power. Caelan's face was grim. "Let them in," he commanded the gatekeeper, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He strode to the great hall, his every step radiating a dangerous calm. Avelina, her heart pounding against her ribs, followed and stood in the shadows of the gallery staircase, a helpless observer of her own fate. Lord Valerius entered the hall not as a defeated man, but as a conqueror. He was flanked by two of his household knights and the bishop, a portly man with shrewd, calculating eyes. Valerius's smile was one of pure, venomous triumph. He had come prepared. "Sir Caelan," he began, his voice dripping with false formality, "we come on a matter of grave importance, a matter of law and of the immortal soul of my poor, misguided niece." He gestured, and a scribe stepped forward, unrolling a heavy parchment scroll that bore the king's royal seal. "You stand accused of abducting a ward of the church," the bishop intoned, his voice filling the hall. "You interfered with a holy covenant between her guardian and the abbess of St. Jude's. You have held the girl against her will in this secular fortress, endangering her virtue and her soul." Caelan did not move. He stood before the great hearth, a pillar of iron. "She came of her own will. She is my ward by feudal right." "A dubious claim at best," Valerius scoffed, "one you have yet to prove. My claim, however, is backed by the king himself." He gestured to the scroll. "This edict demands the immediate return of Avelina of Stonefield to the custody of the church, to fulfill the vows I, her legal guardian, made on her behalf. Her lands and her soul belong to God. Her lands belong to you, once she is walled." "Up," Caelan countered, his voice low and laced with contempt. "Let us not cloak your greed in the robes of piety, my lord." Avelina shrank further into the shadows, wrapping her arms around herself. The sight of her uncle, the sound of his oily, possessive words, stripped away all the progress of the past month. She was once again the terrified orphan, the unwanted burden, the piece of property to be traded. The bishop took a step forward, his rings glittering in the firelight. He held up a hand, silencing any further argument. "This is not a debate, Sir Caelan. It is a legal and spiritual command. You will surrender the girl to our custody. Refuse, and you will be in defiance of a royal edict and stand accused of heresy against the authority of the church. You will be stripped of your titles, your lands forfeit. Your honor will be ash." The threat was absolute. Caelan was trapped. He could fight Valerius's men, but he could not fight the combined weight of the crown and the cross. To do so would make him an outlaw, and every lord in the kingdom would be honor-bound to hunt him down. He would lose everything, and Avelina would be lost with him. Valerius savored the moment, his eyes glittering with malice as he looked past Caelan and up into the shadows where he knew Avelina was hiding. His voice became a cruel, gentle purr. "It is over. Your protector is beaten." He took a step toward the staircase, his hand outstretched as if beckoning a dog. "Avelina, niece, come, down. Your foolish adventure is at an end. The abbess is a forgiving woman, and she is waiting for you." Avelina looked down at the scene, her world crumbling for the second time. She saw the triumphant smirk on her uncle's face and the cold judgment in the bishop's eyes. Then she looked at Caelan. His back was to her, but she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip of his hand on his sword's pommel. He was a lion in a cage, and the bars were closing in. The sanctuary he had built for her was about to be burned to the ground. Avelina felt the weight of every eye in the hall as she descended the stone steps. Each step was a step back toward the convent, back toward the erasure of her life. Her legs trembled, but she forced them to move, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to watch the triumphant sneer on her uncle's face. She could feel his victory, a foul, cloying presence in the air. She came to a stop on the main floor, a few feet from the hearth, alone, ship in a sea of enemies. Lord Valerius stepped toward her, his voice a venomous whisper meant for all to hear. "Did you truly believe this fortress could protect you? Did you think this broken-down knight could defy the will of the king and the word of God for the sake of a worthless, ungrateful orphan?" His words were like stones, each one a sharp blow to the fragile peace she had found. He took another step, his shadow falling over her. "Your disobedience has shamed our family name. You will die penance for it for the rest of your days." As he spoke, Avelina's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of pure instinctual fear. Her fingers closed around a small, worn leather pouch that hung on a cord around her neck. It was the only thing she had of her parents, a keepsake she had been told never to lose. It was her last connection to a life before her uncle, before the fear. Seeing her terror, Caelan finally moved. He did not draw his sword. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed himself between Avelina and her tormentor. He was a wall of silent, immovable iron. His body shielded her from Valerius's hateful gaze. "You have said enough," he bit out, his voice a low growl of contained fury. "She is my ward, not yours," Valerius snarled, his arrogance boiling over. He lunged forward, trying to push past Caelan to grab Avelina's arm. "The law is on my side." Caelan stood his ground, effortlessly blocking him. But in the brief, clumsy scuffle, Valerius's flailing hand caught the leather cord at Avelina's neck. The old worn string, already frayed from years of wear, snapped. Time seemed to slow. The small leather pouch flew from her neck, tumbling through the air. A piece of dark, polished silver slipped free from its confines. It spun, catching the firelight. A flash of captured starlight in the gloom of the hall. It struck the flagstones with a single, sharp, melodic. The sound, so small and clear, silenced everything. Valerius's angry rant, the bishop's impatient muttering, the shuffling of the guardsmen. It all vanished. Every eye in the great hall was drawn to the small object lying on the stone floor. Caelan looked down, his breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lying there, nestled between the cold grey stones, was a piece of silver. It was the head and outstretched wing of a falcon. It was the perfect, unmistakable mirror to the broken piece he kept hidden in his chamber. The piece he had held in his hand just the night before. The ghost he had chased for 10 years across a dozen lands. The failure that had hollowed out his soul and driven him into exile. The vow that had become his life's greatest burden. It all converged on this single, impossible point of light on his floor. He was not a failure. He had not been too late. The fates had not mocked him. They had guided him. That instinct on the road, that inexplicable urge to intervene at the convent gate, it wasn't a knight's honor. It was the echo of a promise made in blood. This was not just Avelina, the orphan. This was Avelina of Stonefield, Robert's daughter, ward, his sacred duty. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Caelan bent down. His gauntlet closed around the silver falcon, its familiar shape a searing brand against his palm. He rose to his full height, his movements deliberate, imbued with a new and terrible grace. He turned to face Lord Valerius. The look in Caelan's eyes was not one of a cornered man. The despair and fury were gone, replaced by a certainty so profound it was chilling. The Lord of Blackwood Reach, the grim and silent knight, was gone. In his place stood a holy avenger, an instrument of a decade-old promise. The power in the hall had not just shifted, it had reversed with the force of a tidal wave. He held up the silver piece for all to see. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, clear, and carried the weight of absolute judgment. "You, my lord," he said, "are a liar and a thief, and this girl is not yours to claim." Lord Valerius stared at the piece of silver in Caelan's hand, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into panicked rage. "A trinket! You would defy a royal edict over a woman's trinket." The bishop, ever the pragmatist, narrowed his eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Sir Caelan? Explain yourself." Caelan did not look at the bishop. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were locked on Valerius. "This is no trinket," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of a decade of grief. From a leather pouch inside his own tunic, he produced a second piece of silver. It was the other half of the falcon, worn smooth from years of being held in a guilty hand. Before the entire hall, he brought the two pieces together. They slid into place with a soft metallic click, forming a perfect, seamless whole. The silver falcon was complete, a solitary, beautiful thing of loyalty and loss, now made whole in the firelight. "This," Caelan announced, his voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed that of the king's edict, "is the sigil of the House of Stonefield. It was entrusted to me 10 years ago in the dust of the Holy Land by a dying man, a man who fought and bled for the cross this bishop so proudly wears." He took a step toward Valerius, who flinched as if struck. "That man was Sir Robert of Stonefield, Avelina's father, my sworn brother. With his last breath, He made me swear an oath upon my soul to find his daughter, to protect her from all harm, and to act as her guardian in his stead. He held up the completed amulet. My right of wardship is not some obscure feudal law. It is a sacred vow made to the dead. A vow you, Lord Valerius, sought to break so you could steal the inheritance of a crusader's orphan. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. To defraud the child of a fallen hero of the crusade was a sin of the highest order. The men-at-arms lining the hall, Caelan's and even Valerius's, shifted, their expressions hardening with contempt for the greedy lord. The bishop saw the immediate and catastrophic shift in power. The proof was undeniable, the vow sacred. To side with Valerius now would be to side with dishonor against a revered crusader knight. He cleared his throat, his face a bland mask of piety. Clearly, there has been a grave misunderstanding. Sir Caelan's claim is, it would appear, paramount. Lord Valerius, your information was clearly incomplete. Valerius was ruined. His support had evaporated. He was exposed as a common thief in a nobleman's clothes. He sputtered, speechless with fury and humiliation. Caelan ignored the bishop. He looked only at the disgraced man who had caused Avelina such pain. "You are less than nothing," he said, his voice quiet but carrying more menace than any shout. "Get out of my hall. Get off my lands. If your shadow falls on Blackwood Reach after sunrise tomorrow, I will not wait for a king's judgment. I will hang you from that gate myself." The command was absolute. There was no appeal. Valerius, his face pale with a mixture of hatred and fear, turned and fled the hall. His men and the now silent bishop trailing in his wake like rats from a sinking ship. The great doors boomed shut, leaving a sudden, profound silence. The storm had passed. In the vast hall, only Caelan and Avelina remained, standing in the warm glow of the hearth. The world had shrunk to this single, quiet space. Avelina stared, her mind reeling. Her father? A vow. This grim, silent knight had not been a stranger who saved her by chance. He had been searching for her. All this time, he had been searching for her. Caelan turned to face her. The terrifying warrior, the judge, was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes were filled with a decade of unshed grief, of lonely searching, and of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. He looked as lost and found as she felt. He held the complete silver falcon on his open palm, offering it to her. He did not speak. No words could possibly hold the meaning of this moment. Words were for contracts, for accusations. This was something else entirely. He stepped closer, and with infinite care, he took the broken leather cord from where it had fallen on her dress. He painstakingly threaded it through the small loop at the top of the joined amulet. He raised his hands, and Avelina instinctively bowed her head. He settled the amulet around her neck, the cool, solid weight of it, a comfort against her skin. His calloused fingers, so used to the unforgiving grip of a sword, brushed against the nape of her neck with a touch so gentle it made her tremble. He had fulfilled his vow. The silver falcon rested whole against her heart. Avelina slowly lifted her head and looked up into his eyes. In their depths, she saw the dust of the Holy Land, the grief for a lost friend, and a fierce, unwavering devotion that was now entirely for her. He had not just saved her life. He had been carrying her with him all along. She raised a hand, not in fear but in acceptance. She laid it flat against the hard plate of his chest, directly over his heart. A silent acknowledgement, a vow answered, a promise received. In the quiet of the great hall, two solitary souls, bound by a ghost and an oath, finally found their sanctuary in each other. The seasons turned, washing the blood and fear from the stones of Blackwood Reach. The grim fortress, once a monument to a man's grief, slowly transformed. Under Avelina's patient hand, the keep found a heart. The herb garden flourished, its scents perfuming the air. Bright tapestries, woven by Avelina and the wives of the guardsmen, now hung in the great hall, their vibrant threads telling stories of courage and hope, silencing the cold echoes of the past. The small, once derelict chapel was now filled with light, its altar always graced with wildflowers. The gates of the keep, once shut tight against the world, now stood open during the day, a symbol of a lord whose watchfulness was no longer born of sorrow, but of a deep and abiding peace. 5 years to the day after Lord Valerius fled in disgrace, Caelan and Avelina stood in the solar overlooking the main courtyard. The setting sun of late summer bathed the world in a soft golden light. Avelina, now the lady of the keep, leaned against her husband, her head resting on his shoulder. The hard lines of duty on Caelan's face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment that sat more naturally than his old grim mask. He was no longer just a lord or a knight, he was a husband and a father. In the courtyard below, a small boy with his mother's copper hair and his father's serious eyes chased a feathered lure through the grass. He laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried on the evening breeze. A man in the livery of a falconer swung the lure, teaching the boy the first lessons of a noble craft. The boy's name was Robert. Caelan's hand rested on the pommel of the sword at his hip. It was an old familiar posture, the warrior's instinct still present. He was, and always would be, the protector. But the gesture was no longer one of restless vigilance. It was one of quiet strength, the guardian of a peace he had fought so hard to find. Avelina saw the motion, felt the familiar tension of the warrior in him. She lifted her own hand and placed it gently over his, her fingers lacing with his on the hilt of his sword. It was a silent conversation, the kind they had mastered long ago. The last rays of the sun caught the polished surface of the silver amulet that rested at the base of her throat. The falcon, whole and unbroken, seemed to glow with an inner fire, a timeless symbol of a promise kept, a destiny fulfilled, and a love forged in the crucible of sorrow. They stood together in the fading light, watching their son, their legacy, play in the heart of their sanctuary. The shadows lengthened, the first stars pricked the purple sky, and a profound, unbroken silence settled over the lands of Blackwood Reach. It was the silence not of loneliness, but of home. The silence of a vow finally at rest. The silence of peace, earned at long last.